the closure of the Strait of Hormuz didn't diminish the strategic importance of maritime chokepoints, it multiplied it. With Iran still restricting passage through Hormuz, global attention has pivoted to the Bab el-Mandeb Strait. This shift is logical. Once Hormuz became constrained, the Red Sea corridor transformed from just another route into the principal fallback artery for oil, refined products, containers, and time-sensitive cargo heading to Europe, the Mediterranean, and parts of North America. This situation has already pushed oil prices above $110 a barrel, and the IMF is warning that the wider conflict is now causing the largest global energy supply disruption on record. Bab el-Mandeb matters immensely. This larger trade system normally carries around 10 to 15% of all world maritime trade, and a huge share of Asia-Europe commerce. The Suez Canal alone handles 10% of world maritime trade and 22% of container trade. Before the Red Sea crisis, the wider Suez-Bab el-Mandeb corridor carried roughly 30% of global container traffic. On the energy side, oil flows through Bab el-Mandeb averaged 8.7 million barrels a day in 2023, then fell to about 4 million barrels a day in the first 8 months of 2024 after Houthi attacks. In essence, this is already a partially degraded corridor. This brings us to the crucial Saudi rerouting story. Saudi Arabia has been moving more crude overland through its east-west pipeline toward Yanbu on the Red Sea. Reuters reported Yanbu exports surged to nearly 4 million barrels a day in late March, with analysts suggesting it could hit 5 million. The EIA notes the pipeline can reach 7 million barrels a day when expanded. But this workaround only functions if the Red Sea outlet remains commercially and militarily usable. Meanwhile, major shipping lines like Maersk, Hapag-Lloyd, and CMA-CGM have again rerouted away from Suez and Bab el-Mandeb, confirming commercial shipping is already pricing in renewed insecurity. This isn't theoretical. From November 2003 to January 2005, the Houthis attacked over 100 merchant vessels, sank 2 ships, and killed 4 sailors. The direct economics of disruption are brutal. A typical Persian Gulf to Amsterdam voyage takes about 19 days through Suez, but nearly 35 days around the Cape of Good Hope. UNCTAD estimates rerouting oil tankers via the Cape raises travel time by 42%, adding roughly 12 days to Asia-Europe voyages. For large gas carriers, fuel burn alone costs roughly $30,000 to $35,000 per day. Multiply that by a 16-day detour, and the extra bunker cost is roughly $480,000 to $560,000 per voyage. And that's before adding war risk insurance, crew, charter, inventory, and scheduling costs. War risk premiums in the wider Gulf have surged by over 1,000% in some cases. This is how a security shock becomes an inflation shock. Longer routes absorb vessel capacity, raise freight bills, tighten tanker availability, and increase the landed cost of everything from diesel to electronics. The critical question isn't if Bab el-Mandeb matters, but how much additional damage a second choke point shock would cause when the first one has already stressed the system. In an intermittent disruption lasting 2 to 4 weeks, Brent likely holds in a $115 to $125 range, and global inflation probably gains another 0.2 to 0.4 percentage points. In a sustained disruption of 1 to 3 months, Brent could move into a $130 to $150 range. Global inflation could rise by 0.5 to 0.9 points, and world growth could lose 0.3 to 0.7 points. But in a dual choke point paralysis, where Hormuz remains constrained and Bab el-Mandeb also becomes commercially unusable for a full quarter, Brent testing $150 to $100 would no longer be an extreme case. The world would face classic stagflation, higher prices, tighter energy supply, longer delivery cycles, and weaker output. Asia would take the first and hardest blow. EIA estimates that 84% of crude oil and condensate and 83% of LNG moving through Hormuz in 2024 went to Asian market. Airlines are already trimming schedules, and factory surveys show higher input costs across much of Asia. If Bab el-Mandeb also becomes unreliable, Asia would face a double hit: reduced access to Middle Eastern energy and costlier export logistics into Europe. For the most exposed importers, a 3-month dual-route shock could plausibly add 0.8 to 1.5 percentage points to inflation and cut 0.3 to 0.8 points from growth, with aviation, petrochemicals, fertilizers, and export manufacturing under sharpest pressure. Europe would face the clearest inflation through logistics shock. The Suez route is Europe's fastest maritime bridge to Asia and the Gulf. IMF Port Watch showed Suez trade down 50% year-on-year in early 2024. The IEA warns the Middle East disruption will hit Europe, especially through diesel and jet fuel. Eurozone business growth has already slowed, and headline inflation has moved back up to 2.5%. A prolonged BAB disruption would likely hit Europe less through absolute fuel shortage, and more through delivered cost inflation, tighter diesel balances, slower restocking, and margin compression. In a sustained scenario, we could expect an added 0.5 to 1.2 percentage points on inflation and a 0.2 to 0.6 point drag on growth for trade-exposed European economies. Africa would experience the most uneven outcome. For energy importers, the result is straightforward: higher fuel costs, higher food transport costs, tighter fertilizer supply, and renewed balance of payments pressure. A joint African report warned that if the Middle East conflict lasts beyond 6 months, Africa could lose 0.2 percentage points of GDP growth. Yet, Africa is not only a victim. Bunkering hubs in places like Walvis Bay, Port Louis, and Tangier are gaining from rerouting around the Cape. Afreximbank has even launched a $10 billion response program. So Africa's picture is split. Egypt loses canal income, East African importers face inflation, but parts of southern and western Africa gain from refueling, port services, and rerouted maritime traffic. North America is less directly exposed on energy but not insulated. The U.S. imported about 500,000 barrels a day of crude and condensate from the Persian Gulf through Hormuz in 2024, equal to only 7% of U.S. crude imports and 2% of U.S. petroleum liquids consumption. This means the U.S. is structurally more protected than Asia or Europe. However, U.S. crude premiums have surged as European and Asian buyers scramble for Atlantic Basin barrels, and U.S. consumers are already seeing higher fuel bills. North America's main channel of impact is not shortage. It's price transmission through globally traded crude, refined products, aviation fuel, and freight. In macro terms, the shock is manageable. In political and consumer terms, it is not. Latin America and the Caribbean would feel the shock through import bills, aviation, and tourism. They are less dependent on Bab el-Mandeb as a physical trade corridor, but very exposed to the second-round effects of high oil, high fertilizer, and expensive aviation fuel. Brazil's Petrobras planned a 55% increase in jet fuel prices, with airlines saying a 10% fare increase is needed for every $1 per gallon rise in jet fuel. Afreximbank's new program explicitly includes Caribbean states, indicating policymakers already view the region as vulnerable. For Latin America, the direct freight shock is smaller than in Europe, but the pass-through into food prices, air travel, and external accounts could still be material, especially for import-dependent island economies. Oceania would be hit through long-distance energy dependence and aviation costs. Air New Zealand is already cutting flights and raising fares after jet fuel costs more than doubled, affecting around 4% of flights and 1% of passengers. This is a warning sign for the wider region. Australia and New Zealand sit far from the conflict zone, but distance does not equal safety when the issue is imported fuel, long-haul aviation, and rerouted global shipping. The immediate pressure point isn't industrial collapse, it's persistent household cost pressure and higher transport costs that arrive with a lag and stay longer than the headline conflict. The broader strategic conclusion is this: once Hormuz is impaired, Bab el-Mandeb stops being a regional choke point and becomes a global single point of failure risk. The world can absorb one disrupted artery for a time. It struggles when the backup artery is also at risk. This is no longer just a Middle East security story. It is now a global story about inflation persistence, freight scarcity, energy repricing, and the fragility of a trade system that still depends on a handful of narrow maritime passages. If Hormuz created the first shock, Bab el-Mandeb could well determine whether that shock remains expensive or becomes systemic.